Charles Best, you all came here to listen to Charles. Charles is the founder of DonorsChoose.org, a nonprofit organization which provides a simple way to address educational inequity. At DonorsChoose.org, public school teachers create classroom project requests, and donors like yourself can pick the projects you want to support. So Charles launched this organization 12 years ago out of a Bronx public high school where he taught history. DonorsChoose.org is one of Oprah Winfrey's ultimate favorite things and was named by Fast Company as one of the 50 most innovative companies in the world. The first time a charity has ever received this recognition. For 3 years, Fortune magazine has named Charles to its 40 under 40 hottest rising stars in business. You know, I explained in the opening that SUNY Geneseo was my alma mater. What I didn't mention, yeah, I heard some whoopies. I didn't mention is that I am the chair of the SUNY Geneseo Foundation Board. You know, we're always trying to figure out and match campus need to donor intent. So I really find the whole concept of DonorsChoose.org very intriguing, and I really can't wait to hear more. Let's watch a quick video about DonorsChoose.org.
There are few times in history when the saying, "we're all in this together," would be more applicable than right now.
Charles Best, he came up with a revolutionary idea during lunch in the teacher's lounge.
My colleagues and I were talking about books that we wanted our students to read, field trips we wanted to take them on, art supplies that we needed, but these ideas wouldn't go beyond the teacher's lunchroom. And then I just figured that there were people from all walks of life who wanted to help improve our public schools.
Through Donors Choose, ordinary citizens can directly fund projects initiated by enterprising public school teachers.
Teachers request dictionaries, science kits, field trips, resources that their students need to thrive. Then you can give to the project request that most inspires you with a donation of any amount.
It's such a simple, wonderful idea. You know exactly who you're helping and how you're helping them.
I love to give and know that I have a connection.
It's a very easy way to give back to public schools.
This is exactly the kind of social innovation we should be encouraging across this country.
I love DonorsChoose.org, and it's why I'm on the board and why I'm committed to helping it in any way I can.
Make sure you check it out, DonorsChoose.org.
Let's not underestimate the power each of us has to change the world for someone.
All right, please welcome Charles Best to the stage. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey there, good morning. Jack, thank you for that introduction. Thanks especially to each of you for sharing a bit of your morning. I am honored to be here. Today, I want to tell you a story of crowdfunding and how it could revolutionize education for kids in the United States. My goal is for you to get fired up and to start thinking about how crowdfunding could revolutionize higher education in each of your own countries. Last week, I asked the folks at Ellucian where you're located, because I wanted to get a pulse on crowdfunding in the countries where you work. I learned that many of you hail from Commonwealth countries like England and Australia. So I went to Kickstarter. Show of hands, how many of you are familiar with Kickstarter? All right, it looks like about half of you. For those who didn't raise your hands, Kickstarter is a funding platform for creative projects. Last year, people raised $500 million through this site. And we're looking at 3 projects from folks in the UK and Australia. That book you see on the left is a project from a guy in Southsea, England, named Sam, who wants people to know what it's like to have dyslexia. So he designed a book where the typography and the letters morph into different shapes switch places, play tricks on the eye. This is a book that shows someone what it's like to struggle with reading as a dyslexic person. Sam asked for £5,000 to publish this book, but 1,500 people decided to give him £55,000 to do just that. That cute little item in the middle is the brainchild of a guy named Keynote in London who designed a cardboard sidekick in a huge range of complexions and facial expressions so that anybody could have their own stand-up mini-me on their desk. No glue or scissors required. Keynote needed £3,000 to do a run of these cardboard sidekicks, and about 500 people provided that funding. The photo you see on the right is a project from a woman named Louise in Sydney, Australia. She believes that to really get to know a city, a place, you shouldn't go to its tourist attractions. You should instead go visit and get to know the places where people really live. So she has envisioned a book, a travel book, about all of the unfamous suburbs that surround famous cities. About 800 people thought that was a book that they would like to read, and they gave Louise $20,000 to publish it. Now, only 5 years ago, these creative people, Sam, Keynote, Louise, would have needed a rich uncle, or industry connections, or years of working their way up the ladder before they could have done these projects. Kickstarter does away with all that. It lets you ask your friends and the world at large to support your creativity without any gatekeepers or tastemakers standing in your way. If your idea is awesome, it'll probably get funded. The folks at Ellucian also told me that many of you hail from Latin America. So I went to Etsy. Show of hands, how many of you are familiar with Etsy? All right, here too, it looks like about half of you. For those who didn't raise their hands, Etsy is a marketplace of things that are made by hand. Last year alone, people sold $1 billion of crafts through the site. And did you know that crafters in Latin America have 40,000 different items for sale on Etsy? We're looking at 3 of them. On the left, you see knit wool lampshades from a woman in Santiago, Chile, a deer head cutout designed by a guy in Cali, Colombia, and a stoneware foot planter from a woman in Lima, Peru. Etsy items like these are mostly made by people who used to work office jobs all day, reluctantly. They really wanted to be crafting, but they could only do so as a hobby in their spare time. Few of these people could have scored the investment that you need to make a prototype that a factory can manufacture, or persuade Macy's or Walmart to buy their product, or raise millions of advertising dollars to get consumers to sell their product. That's a process which lets only a lucky few become designers. And of course, it's a process that can suck the personality out of your creation. Then Etsy came along. Now crafters can pursue their passion as their day job and sell their creations to people all over the world. They don't have to break through all the barriers that until recently stood in the way of anyone who wanted to make beautiful things for a living. So after checking out the Kickstarter projects in the UK and Australia and the Etsy items from folks in Latin America, I wanted to go hyper-local. And what you'll see here are some of the 800 projects that teachers in Anaheim alone have gotten funded through our site. Those kids on the left are in Mrs. Brown's 6th grade class. She's just 5 miles away from here. And you'll see that they're holding an iPad because Mrs. Brown wanted her students to be able to record interviews with immigrants who had recently arrived here in Anaheim and do web research on the countries and cultures that they came from. Mrs. Brown called her project Tablets for Tolerance. Those kids in the middle who are playing recorders are in Mrs. Johnson's music class 3 miles from here. Their teacher wanted each of her students to have a recorder so that they could put on a spring concert and achieve the California state standard for every student to know how to read music notation. On the right, those 2 kids that are doing a cooking recipe are in Mrs. Christofferson's class 3 miles from here. Her project is called Cooking in the Dark. She called it that because her students are blind. Now, cooking is one of those things that you learn by observing. So it's very tough for kids who are blind to pick up this skill. So Mrs. Christofferson has requested Braille measuring cups and spoons and a microwave oven with Braille buttons and other equipment that will help her students cook in the dark. 10 donors made her classroom wish come true. At DonorsChoose.org, teachers go straight to the public with their best ideas for helping students learn. They don't have to have first paid their dues. They don't need to get an administrator to sign off. In fact, there's nothing standing between their idea and a potential supporter. There's a change underway, which I want to talk about with you tonight. It's a change in who you have to know, and how lucky you have to be, and how long you have to wait to bring a good idea to life. It's about a new kind of marketplace where gatekeepers do not stand in your way. DonorsChoose.org is a pioneer of this movement, often called crowdfunding. So I want to share the journey with you. I want to give you an inside look into how it began, how it took off, and what this means for you. And then we're going to do something that has never been done at Ellucian Live ever before. Last show of hands. How many of you have had a teacher in high school who changed your life? All right, it looks like most of you. I had a teacher like that too. His name was Mr. Buxton. He was my English teacher and my wrestling coach. And when I showed up as a dorky freshman in high school, Mr. Buxton spoke to me like he would to any adult. If he approved or disapproved of something I'd done, I knew it right away, because he didn't have that mask that some teachers, some grown-ups put on when they're talking to kids. If I asked him a question on Wednesday, he'd come back to me on Friday saying that he'd thought about it. And he really had. He made you feel like he wanted you on his team. And looking back on it, I think it was Mr. Buxton who made me want to be a teacher. So 14 years ago, I started teaching history at Wings Academy, a public high school in the Bronx. But Wings Academy did not have the same resources as when I was in Mr. Buxton's class. Where I went to high school, we went on field trips into the woods. We had graphing calculators for trigonometry. We had the supplies you'd need for just about any art project. We did not want for anything. But when I started teaching in the Bronx, I saw firsthand that all schools are not created equal. My colleagues and I would spend a lot of our own money on copy paper and pencils And we often couldn't get the resources our students needed to get excited about learning. We talk about books we wanted our students to read, a field trip we wanted to take them on, a microscope that we needed to bring science to life. What I wanted for my students was Little House on the Prairie. Those of you who only saw the TV show might think I was dumbing things down, but those of you who read the book will remember that Little House on the Prairie is a fascinating account of pioneer life. Ma and Pa fail to make a good living from farming. Railroad tycoons and grain monopolies make all the money. Ma has a racist attitude toward Native Americans that's typical of her time, but Pa can put himself in their shoes. I got to stop myself because I will talk all morning about Little House on the Prairie because I love this book. And my students, even those who had never left New York City, they loved it too. But the school system was not about to buy the Little House series for each of my students. So every day before school, I would get up before dawn and go to the copy shop that was open 24 hours. And I would photocopy that day's section of Little House on the Prairie for each of my students, which probably was not strictly legal given copyright law. And as I was making copies, I started thinking about all those resources that my colleagues wanted for their students. And it occurred to me that there must be people out there who'd want to help teachers like us if they could see where their money was going. So using pencil and paper, I drew out a website where public school teachers could create classroom project requests, and donors could choose a project they wanted to support. For $2,000, a programmer from Poland was willing to build that site and code my pencil and paper drawings. It was super rudimentary, as I know many of you are in IT, and so you will appreciate a website whose back end was only one page that you'd have to scroll down for like 15 minutes to get to the teacher or the project record that you were looking for. To process a donation, I used one of those black boxes that you see at the grocery store where you punch in the credit card number and the dollar amount and you send it over a telephone line. It was like PayPal, but by hand. And it's a very good thing that my students were helping me to get the site off the ground. So then I had to get my colleagues to try out this site and post the first projects. Now, I don't know how it is at the colleges and universities where you work, but at my high school, if you wanted to get teachers to do something, you gave them free food. Sounds like maybe it does work that way at your places of work. Awesome. Now, what you're seeing right there, that is my mom's roasted pear dessert. She makes them with apricot jam and spices and orange rind. They taste something delicious. I brought my mom's dessert into the teacher's lunchroom, and as my colleagues prepared to pounce, I said, "Hold up, there's a toll. If you eat one of these pears, you've got to go to this new website called donorschoose.org and ask for whatever it is you most want for your students. Propose the project that you've always wanted to do with them." Sounded like a pretty good deal, and took only a few minutes for my colleagues to scarf the 11 pears, and then they proceeded to post the first 11 projects on our site. The health teacher, she ate the dessert first, and she wanted to do a pregnancy prevention project for which she needed baby think-it-over dolls, which are life-size, life-weight dolls that cry at 3 in the morning and need to be fed and show a teenager what it would be like if they had a kid. The English teacher, he ate the dessert next. He wanted to get his students ready for the SAT college entrance exam, and so he requested test prep books. The art teacher wanted to do a wall-to-wall quilt with each of her students sewing a square, and for that she needed fabric and thread and needles. The other history teacher and I, we wanted our students to meet Mokhtar Tayeb. He had been profiled in The New Yorker after escaping from modern-day slavery. He had received asylum, was living in the Bronx, and traveling the country telling people that slavery still exists. Well, our students had just read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and we thought how amazing it would be if our students could meet a man who himself had escaped from slavery. Our students read the New Yorker profile, and we posted a project to bring in Mokhtar Tayeb so our students could speak with him and he could share his experience about escaping slavery. Those were 4 of the first 11 projects ever created on our site. My aunt, who's a nurse, she funded the first project, but I didn't know any more donors to fund the other 10 projects. So I funded them myself, which I could afford to do because I was still living at home with my parents. And they weren't charging me any rent, so I could spare some of my teacher's salary. I donated anonymously, so my colleagues mistakenly thought that the website actually worked. And that there were donors on the site just waiting to fulfill teachers' classroom dreams. That rumor, that false rumor, spread across the Bronx, and teachers started posting hundreds of projects which needed a whole lot more money than what I could afford by living at home with my parents. I was in a really tough spot, not knowing how I was going to get these projects funded. My students came to the rescue. They could see the potential of this experiment to change their lives at school. I think they also felt bad for me. So for 4 months, they volunteered every day after school to spread word to potential donors. They addressed and compiled 2,000 letters by hand to people all over the country, telling them about this website where somebody with $10 could be a classroom hero. We wanted to get the cheapest postal rate, so we sorted the mail ourselves, and every desk in my classroom represented a different region of the country, piled high with envelopes. Then we carted the sorted letters to the post office and crossed our fingers. It worked. My students' letter writing campaign generated $30,000 in donations to classroom projects on our site. We were off. Another year went by, and then 9/11 happened. And teachers at the schools beside Ground Zero started posting projects to recover from the attacks on the World Trade Center. A math teacher requested a new set of calculators because her student's original set was sealed at the disaster site, and their classroom had been relocated to a basement. A high school art teacher wanted to bring in an Afghan artist to do after-school workshops so students could learn about Afghanistan. There was a first grade teacher who wrote about her students being saved by a particular group of firemen, and her students wanted to thank the firemen who had saved them. They wanted to do a musical performance in front of their fire ladder company, and for that they needed musical instruments. There were hundreds of these projects related to 9/11, and I thought that New York media would jump on this story. This was right when everybody yearned to participate in the recovery effort. The Red Cross had almost too many blood donations to put to good use, and here was this direct way for people to help. But no reporter would give me the time of day. I must have called 100 of them with no success. So I figured I better aim higher. The Holy Grail was the New York Times. They had a new reporter covering nonprofits and philanthropy. Her name was Stephanie Strom. I figured if we could get Stephanie Strom of the New York Times to do a story about our website, we would have a shot at big-time impact. So I put together a package of materials, and I mailed them off to Stephanie. I didn't hear back. So after a few weeks, I called her up, and she was nice, but she said we were awfully small potatoes. She said, if ever I'm doing a story on online charities, which at the time was a new concept, maybe I'll slot you into that list, but I'm afraid you are not newsworthy. Damn. Then I found a directory of the top people at Newsweek. And I called the senior editor there. I called Jonathan Alter. I called him first because his last name started with A, and he showed up at the top of the alphabetical directory. I called him during my lunch hour, and his assistant must have been out to lunch because he picked up the phone. I said, hey, I'm a teacher up in the Bronx. I started this nonprofit with my students. Do you want to hear about it? And he said, sure. He didn't hang up on me. We talked for 45 minutes, and that night, he wrote a story for the Newsweek website suggesting that this experiment growing out of a Bronx classroom might one day change philanthropy. Well, then I called up Stephanie Strom at the New York Times all excited, and I said, hey, Newsweek saw us as newsworthy, at least for their website, so won't you give us a second look? Then she dashed my hopes. She said, I wouldn't touch your story with a 10-foot pole now that another reporter has covered you. The New York Times does not follow in the footsteps of other publications. I felt like an idiot for having told her that another media outlet had broken our story. So I sent her an email apologizing for being so dumb. She could tell how badly I felt. She took pity on me, so she wrote back. And she said, I shouldn't feel so bad because I didn't have a chance in the first place. Because her editors had asked her to focus on charities responding to 9/11. There was my opening. I crafted an email to Stephanie describing all of the projects that teachers beside Ground Zero were creating on our site related to 9/11. And I called her up over the weekend on purpose, so I knew I wouldn't interrupt her while she was on deadline, and I would go straight to voicemail, and left a message saying, hey, this is the last time you will ever hear from me. If you could just read this one final pitch. Monday, I was back at school teaching, and I checked my email in between periods. Stephanie had written back. She wanted to come do an interview for a major feature story in the New York Times. Let me tell you, my parents raised me to be humble, but it felt like the skies had opened and I had to shout. This was the New York Times. I forwarded Stephanie's email to my friend and I said, guess who said she wouldn't touch our story with a 10-foot pole and now wants an interview? That's what hustling will get you. I beat my chest. I talked all kinds of smack. I thought that I had hit forward. I'm getting nervous adrenaline reliving this memory right now. I had hit reply. And the moment I realized I did this really fancy IT thing that you would know about, I yanked the electrical cord out of the socket. But it was too late. I sent that trash-talking, chest-beating email to Stephanie Strom, philanthropy reporter for the New York Times. So naturally, I sent her another email apologizing for being so dumb. And to Stephanie's eternal credit, she did not hold it against us. She had mercy. She went on to write a major feature story for the Times, arguing that DonorsChoose.org was the future of philanthropy. And since then, we've been working our tails off to try and prove her right. As of today, more than 1 million people have given $230 million to classroom projects at half of all the public schools in America. There are 11 million kids from low-income families. Thank you. Thank you. 11 million kids from low-income families who've got books, art supplies, technology that they need to learn. I never thought that I would one day get to go to Ellucian Live and speak with folks like you and share numbers like that. And I never dreamed that crowdfunding would become part of the zeitgeist. When DonorsChoose.org began, crowdfunding wasn't even a word. It was years away from becoming a word. And now, it's a movement. Today, there are hundreds of websites where people on the front lines can identify a need they see, propose a project they want to do, secure a loan for a venture they want to start, and then anyone, no matter the size of their wallet, can become a patron, a financier, a philanthropist. These sites are launching in all kinds of countries and sectors. I told you about Kickstarter. Kiva lets you make a microloan to an entrepreneur in the developing world. Watsi lets you fund medical care for someone living in poverty. Love Animals lets you choose a group of animals to save. Crowdfunding is going to get even bigger. I'll bet you that within the next 10 years, crowdfunded projects and ventures will account for a real percentage of the United States' gross domestic product. And I hope this is where you will start thinking about how you could use crowdfunding to fuel your institutions of higher learning. Now I want to give you an inside look into how we've made crowdfunding work for public schools, for government-supported schools, here in the United States. When a teacher submits a project for funding, we first make sure that it's legit, and we email follow-up questions to the teacher if anything is unclear about what students will learn. This school year alone, we're going to get 150,000 classroom project requests, each of which must be carefully vetted and reviewed. That obviously represents a heck of a lot of work, and we used to pay people to do it. Then we realized that we could enlist our best teacher users to vet other teachers' project requests. So now, if you're a teacher and you've had 20 projects funded on our site and shown yourself to be an especially responsible, responsive user, you are invited to volunteer your time to vet and post other teachers' project requests. Think of it as a cross between academic peer review and Wikipedia. And now that we crowdsource this labor instead of paying people to do it, the average time it takes us to vet and authenticate a teacher's project has gone from 10 days to 1.5 days. That's the power of pushing intelligence out to the edge, of seeing people on the front lines as the experts, which is what crowdfunding is all about. So now the project's up on donorschoose.org. At any moment, 25,000 classroom projects are live on our site. That's a lot to choose from. So we encourage donors to express a personal passion and see the projects that match. A few years ago, a writer for Fortune magazine was doing a story on Kiva and donorschoose.org as the two websites that Fortune magazine thought were going to change philanthropy. The writer was decently impressed by our site, but after our interview, he said that his personal passion was saving the salmon in the Pacific Northwest, which was his nice way of saying that he would not be donating at our site because education wasn't quite his cause. He was all about salmon in the Northwest. But before he left the room, I did a keyword search for salmon, and up came 5 classroom projects that matched. The second result was a project from a high school teacher in Oregon who had created a salmon hatchery in the river flowing by his school, and he needed hip waders for his students to maintain and build out the hatchery. The top result for keyword salmon was a project from a teacher on an island off Alaska, teaching in a one-room schoolhouse. She wrote in her project essay that she was 45 minutes away from the nearest store by airplane. All of her students are native Alaskans, and they had recorded their parents' folktales about salmon, done research on salmon, and they wanted to share that work with the outside world, for which they needed a printer and a scanner. So here was this guy who had a passion for salmon and 5 projects to choose from. As a result, there's a group of kids at an Oregon high school who now have the hip waders they need to build out their teacher's salmon hatchery. The last part of the donorschoose.org process is the best part. When a project gets funded, we don't hand out cash to the teacher. We purchase the resources and have them delivered to the classroom. Even if the project is therapeutic horseback riding for disabled students, we pay the horseback riding stable to provide that service. And then every donor, even if they've given just $1, gets photos of their project in action, a thank you note from the teacher, an impact letter describing what students are actually learning, and a cost report showing how every dollar was spent. Donors who give $50 or more also get handwritten thank you letters from the students. Our donors get to see and feel the impact that they've had and even correspond with the classroom they chose to help. Throughout this process, we strive to be totally transparent. I'll give you one example. Once in a long while, about 3% of the time, we're not able to provide feedback, classroom feedback, to the donor because the teacher and students, for whatever reason, were not able to put together those thank you letters. Internally, we call this a jilted donor situation. And when it happens, we reach out to the donor and acknowledge that we've fallen short, even though they've probably forgotten that they were ever due a thank you package in the first place, since that's kind of a novel thing to get after a charitable donation. And we offer to fund another project of that donor's choice on our dime. Sounds like a kind of fall on your sword thing to do, but most of our donors are blown away that we would proactively apologize for not providing that thank you package from the classroom. They don't usually take us up on our offer of funding another project for them, but our apology note does often prompt them to make a whole new donation. We once looked at the numbers and concluded that our biggest revenue driver was screwing up and admitting it. So that's how DonorsChoose.org began. That's how it works under the hood. But our real story is the 250,000 teachers who use our site to give their kids a better education. I want to tell you about one of those teachers. Debbie Gardino is a special education teacher in Chesapeake, Virginia. Big reason she became a special needs teacher is that her son has Asperger's. His doctors and his teachers predicted that he would never graduate, never be independent. But Debbie believed otherwise, and her son proved otherwise. A few years ago, he got his master's degree, and last year, he got married. Debbie's gotten funding for 80 projects on DonorsChoose.org. The most recent of her funded projects was for touchscreen tablets, which are enabling her students with cerebral palsy to communicate for the first time. When Joplin, Missouri was hit by a tornado, Debbie took matters into her own hands. She flew down to Joplin on her own dime, of her own volition, and went door to door telling any teacher who'd listen how they could rebuild using DonorsChoose.org. A lot of the teachers Debbie spoke to told her about a young man named Will Norton, a high school senior who had been driving back from graduation when the tornado sucked him out of his car. And what teachers said about this young man struck a real chord with Debbie. I think it reminded her of her own son, and she dedicated her mission to him. Debbie inspired Joplin teachers to create 800 projects on our site, 800 calls for help, 800 ideas for rejuvenating Joplin classrooms. These projects requested playground equipment, classroom furniture, first aid kits and flashlights, therapy resources like knitting needles and yarn, books, and more books. 5,000 of our donors gave $500,000 to fully fund nearly every Joplin project. The outpouring of emotion between Joplin teachers and their donors, the photos and thank yous, the messages they posted back and forth was something to behold. At the reopening of Joplin schools, many teachers greeted Debbie with screams of joy. They'd gotten funding for enough projects to rebuild their classrooms even better than before. About a year ago, I think most of you will remember another horrific tornado, this time in Moore, Oklahoma. 23 school district buildings were battered terribly. 2 schools were flattened. 7 students died. I'll give you one guess as to what Debbie did. She flew down to Moore, Oklahoma, and told teachers how they could rebuild using our site. But this time, Debbie didn't go alone. She was joined by 3 teachers from Joplin, Missouri, who'd used our site to rebuild, who road-tripped down to Moore, Oklahoma, to tell their brethren how they could rebuild through our site and to connect more teachers with our community of what we call citizen philanthropists. Our donors gave $1 million to fund projects at tornado-stricken schools in Moore, Oklahoma. Several of these projects were created by a teacher named Karen Marinelli, who had saved her students' lives during the tornado by lying on top of them, although the ceiling caved in and it broke her back. This past September, Karen returned to school, returned to teaching in a wheelchair, but uncowed. And let me tell you what an honor it was for my colleagues and I to fulfill her funded projects. It was these bookshelves and a reading rug and a rocking chair that she could move into from her wheelchair and read to her students. As you can probably gather, our site is the backdrop to hundreds of thousands of human interest stories. And I really appreciate your letting me share a few of those stories with you. Some people think that's all DonorsChoose.org and crowdfunding are good for. One-to-one connections, feel-good acts of kindness, warm and fuzzy, but nothing that's going to change the system itself. A lot of traditional foundations and policy experts ask, where's the beef? They worry even that DonorsChoose.org might let government off the hook by letting citizens step in when the system falls short, which is an understandable concern. This morning, I want to address that skepticism. There are 3 ways that we could have an impact far beyond the books, art supplies, field trips, and technology that we deliver. 3 ways that we could be a force for changing and reforming the system itself. The first way is by helping entrepreneurs and inventors to introduce new tools to teachers. For a long time, inventors and entrepreneurs stayed away from K-12 education. You'll have to tell me if this has been the same for university education. They stayed away from K-12 education because they did not see a market where the best product wins. They did not see teachers, the front-end users, being given purchasing power or decision-making power. Instead, they saw 12,000 different school districts, each with its own procurement officer. They saw an educational industrial complex that requires a force of salespeople and lobbyists to penetrate. And so inventors and entrepreneurs stayed away from early childhood and K through 12 education. Well, now, inventors can use DonorsChoose.org to circumvent that complex and connect directly with teachers. We're looking at 2 examples. And I know that there are a lot of IT and technology-savvy folks here, so this might be the first time that someone can guess what both of these images are. Let's start with the first image. Anybody want to shout out what they think that first image on the left is? Yes, 3D printer, correct. Second image. No one's ever guessed this. The image on the right. It does a scanning of a sort. All right, first let's focus on that left image. It is indeed a 3D printer made by MakerBot, which ran a $2 million match offer on DonorsChoose for any teacher requesting one. I was looking at some of the 3D printing projects that teachers near here have created, and I saw one where a teacher wants to use their 3D printer, and is using their 3D printer, to show students how synthetic limbs are prototyped and manufactured for wounded warriors. The image on the right, here's the answer, is an open ROV, open source underwater robot that has a video camera and a remote control so that you can explore the ocean depths. There's a match offer on our site right now for any teacher who requests an underwater robot to take their students 12,000 leagues under the sea. Maybe not 12,000 leagues, but well underwater, where students can experience an ecosystem, an aquatic ecosystem that they might never otherwise appreciate. Now, MakerBot and OpenROV are 2 companies that were never about to hire a sales force to try and break into K-12 education. But by using our site, they've been able to introduce 3D printing and underwater exploration to thousands of kids from low-income communities. And we think more inventors and entrepreneurs may want to use the same strategy to introduce new discoveries, new innovations, new technologies directly to classroom teachers. Second way that we think we could change the system itself is by opening up our data. 250,000 teachers at half of all the public schools in America have created 650,000 classroom projects on our site. And by opening up all that data, which we've now done, we can help people make discoveries about what resources teachers most need in particular cities and states. We can help people see that Louisiana high school teachers clearly need a lot more environmental science technology in their classrooms, as expressed by the projects that they're creating on our site. We can show schools of education that a lot of special education teachers are requesting books for students to read to therapy dogs because they've seen that special needs students are often reluctant to read out loud in front of the classroom because they're afraid that they're going to be taunted. But that if you can give that student a book to read to a therapy dog, they've now got a non-judgmental, 100% attentive, rapt audience to read out loud to. And these students can blossom in that environment. And that's, of course, an insight that no school of education is hip to. It's the kind of thing that only classroom teachers discover. The founder of LinkedIn made a donation so that we could hire a crackerjack data scientist to help us realize the potential of our data, to help show what resources teachers most need, what topics are trending in their minds, and what drives citizen philanthropy, what drives crowdfunding. He started by having some fun, and he analyzed giving on our site based on gender, and this is looking at 1.3 million donors, so it's serious. And he found that women donors tend to give throughout the school year, while male donors tend to give on holidays, on days of remembrance, on special occasions. Internally, we hypothesized that altruism comes more naturally and easily and organically to women, and that men need an external stimulus to be philanthropic, like a reminder of a day that they're supposed to be charitable. Then we took a look at giving based on astrological sign. And I'm not going to ask the Leos and the Cancers in this room to raise their hands, because your cohort not only makes smaller average donations, but gives less frequently. Aries and Taurus should be acknowledged for giving frequently, but they tend to make smaller donations. And if there are Capricorns in the room, would you mind raising your hands so we can acknowledge you as a group that not only gives more generously when you give, but gives more often. Now getting a little bit more substantive, and that astrological stuff, we have no hypothesis. We leave that to you to figure out what's going on there, but it is statistically significant, if you can believe it. A little more substantive now. Our data scientists took a look at the 103,000 book projects that teachers have created on our site. And the short of it is that if you have a kid between the ages of 8 and 14 years old, or a grandkid, or a student of that age, you should think about getting them Diary of a Wimpy Kid, because our teachers are trying to tell the world that that book is particularly effective at getting kids hooked on reading, as expressed by the projects that they're creating on our site. Last analysis I want to show you is of the impact of the recession on high poverty versus high income, wealthy classrooms. The results really surprised us. You'll see that in high poverty classrooms, the recession led to a 5x increase in the proportion of requests for essential materials like copy paper and basic books and pencils, as compared to enrichment requests for butterfly cocoons and field trips and owl pellets. By contrast, in middle income and wealthy communities, the recession led to no such increase in the proportion of requests for really basic materials. Our data shows that the recession had a terribly regressive, disparate impact on public school classrooms, where kids in high poverty communities found themselves in classrooms that did not have basic materials, while kids in middle income and wealthy communities continued to go to classrooms that at least had the essentials present. This just gives you a flavor for what's possible. But our big dream is to help governments spend taxpayer dollars more wisely, more efficiently, more responsively, because they can see classroom needs as they emerge in real time. We can give voice to classroom teachers at the budget-making and policy-making table, because we think that hardworking teachers know their kids better than anybody else in the system. I'm glad you agree. The last way that we think we can change the system itself is politically the spiciest. Internally, we call it a third way on teacher merit pay. About a year ago, we got a major grant from Google to forge a partnership with the College Board, where we gave donors choose classroom funding credits to teachers who launched and helped their students pass math and science AP courses. First, teachers got upfront donors choose funding so that they could get the graphing calculators that they would need to teach calculus. They'd be able to create the laboratory that they would need to teach biology AP. And then this May, every student who passes their math or science AP exam will unlock $100 of donors choose classroom funding for their teacher. So if you're one of these participating teachers and 20 of your students pass the biology advanced placement exam, you get a $2,000 donorschoose.org funding credit to spend on your own classroom projects or on your colleagues' classroom projects. And we're now, the results were so compelling that we're now taking this approach with kids learning to code, specifically girls learning to code. Right now, any public school teacher in America can earn $1,000 of donorschoose.org classroom funding credits if and when 4 of their female students demonstrate proficiency in computer science. We're partnering with Khan Academy, with Code Academy, with Code.org. Think of it indeed as filling your talent pipeline for your next colleagues, who, especially in IT. Now, these donors choose classroom funding credits that go to teachers whose students pass the math and science AP exam, the donors choose classroom funding credits that go to teachers who help their girls learn how to code, might sound like a performance bonus. And in fact, it's a financial reward that's commensurate to student educational outcomes. But by switching the currency with which the performance bonus is paid from cash money to classroom funding, we've created something entirely different. We're speaking to teachers better angels and looking to double down on all the amazing stuff that they're clearly doing in the classroom. You can imagine what the dynamic is like for students who can say, you see that classroom library? I got that for our classroom when I passed the biology AP exam. You remember that field trip we went on yesterday? I made that possible when I learned how to code. Teachers and teachers' unions have been much more welcoming of this third way on teacher merit pay. And we think that we just might have found common ground between the reformer camp and the teachers' union camp in what has been a vicious debate over performance pay. That is just about the end of my remarks. And now it is time for us to do something that has never been done at Ellucian Live ever before. The folks at Ellucian were kind enough to give me a speaker's fee. And I want to invite each of you to spend my speaker's fee on classroom projects of your choice. That's why in your, on your name badge sheet, you've got a card with a philanthropic gift code printed on it. And for those folks who are worrying, ooh, do I still have that? Ellucian is going to email you your gift code again so that you've still got it. Not that we would ever suspect you of losing every single bit of registration material you have, but this gift code represents $5 for you to apply to the classroom project that makes your eye twinkle. This is a gift of giving that Stephen Colbert, who's on our board of directors, every time I speak I try and gratuitously reference that he's on our board of directors. This gift of giving is something that Stephen Colbert gives to every guest who goes on his show. Amy Sedaris, who's on the left, she spent her DonorsChoose.org gift card on providing a Kentucky classroom with science equipment. Kevin Bacon spent his Donors Choose gift code to provide Lincoln Logs and Tinker Toys to a Brooklyn classroom. David Mamet in the middle spent his on an art project from a classroom in the Gulf Coast that wanted to express its feelings about the BP oil disaster. Christiane Amanpour spent her gift code, her Donors Choose gift code, on materials and tactile games for students with autism. Tom Brokaw decided to support a tablet from a classroom in Washington State. I can't wait to see which individual classroom projects you choose to support. If all of you spend your $5 philanthropic gift code, you will have reached tens of thousands of students in low-income communities. So I hope that you will go to our site and find a project that really speaks to you. Could be the town where you grew up, or the sport you played in school, your favorite author as a kid, the hobby that you're now pursuing. Find a project that really does speak to you personally, and then when you've picked your project, tell the teacher and students why you chose their project. When you take this action, you will be a card-carrying member of the crowdfunding movement. Kickstarter, Etsy, DonorsChoose.org, these are all sites that let so-called amateurs, the people on the front lines, go public with their originality. They're crowdfunding marketplaces where people who don't have industry connections can connect directly with like-minded folks and do amazing, amazing things. Think of the impact that Debbie Gardino had using our site. Now, you don't have to be as saintly as Debbie, but I do hope that you will join this movement and think about how crowdfunding could fuel higher education and the institutions where you work. My last ask is that you will indeed become a citizen philanthropist with that gift code. See what you and an incredible teacher can accomplish together when gatekeepers do not stand in your way. Thank you for your time this morning.